Hi, everyone. It's Miss Ulrich here. I'm here to talk to you about what life was like for Blacks after the Civil War. Remember, after the Civil War, at least on paper, Blacks' lives were supposed to get dramatically better. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment granting Black citizenship, and the 15th Amendment giving Blacks the right to vote, it looked like things would be a whole lot better. But as we're going to see from the following slides, that was not necessarily the case. Um, as the Black codes got erased around the 1880s, which was mentioned in another video today, they were replaced with what were called Jim Crow laws. And these were meant to segregate or separate Blacks from whites, continually trying to make them feel inferior. Jim Crow is not a real person. It was just named after a minstrel show that portrayed Blacks in a very demeaning light. And so these Jim Crow laws that segregated blacks from whites spread across the South predominantly, although the North was not immune from Jim Crow laws, but they were predominantly in the South. So you might see separate drinking fountains like we see here, separate waiting rooms, separate seats on a public bus, separate railroad cars, separate hospitals, separate prisons, all sorts of different ones. Here you can see separate movie theaters, separate hotels. I personally think the craziest Jim Crow law was in one place. They said that the Black and white students' textbooks could not be housed in the same facility. Even the textbooks of the kids had to be separated. As you can see in the lower right, schools were also segregated as a result of these Jim Crow laws. And it wasn't just separated facilities. As you can tell from these pictures, the Blacks' facilities were far, far worse off than the whites. For instance, white schools received 10 times as much funding as Black kids' schools. Think about the ramifications of this. If this was going on in the 1880s and continued for the next 60 years, which it will, it's going to have a huge impact on how educated Blacks can get, how much success they can get in terms of jobs after schooling. Plessy versus Ferguson was a monumental Supreme Court decision passed in decided in 1896, started because a Black man was trying to sit in a white train car, and that violated these Jim Crow laws. And ultimately, the Supreme Court rules in this decision, the whole notion of separate but equal was okay. And this is basically legalizing Jim Crow laws. Like I said, these are going to be on the books, these segregated everything, separated lunch counters and restaurants. Like I said, so many different aspects. These are going to be on the books now and allowed for the next, 50, 60 years. So a very important Supreme Court decision. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is not only are they going to be segregated facilities, but the whole separate but equal, the equal part is not going to be followed. And so, like I said, like with the schools, Black schools are going to get way less funding. Let's talk about politically. Remember, the 15th Amendment gave Blacks the right to vote. So as a result, as you can see here, they voted in large numbers. Many whites had to declare a loyalty oath after the Civil War, and some refused to do that. So they were at first ineligible to vote. As a result, we see our first Black politicians in Congress. And you can see the numbers here that there are definitely a lot more Blacks that than previously the whites were used to. And so, unfortunately, some whites that were used to having more power politically were not okay with that. And so, different measures are going to be passed to try to bring the South back to the way that it was before in terms of having Blacks not have a voice politically. One way to do that was through the poll tax. This was implemented in which it required people to pay a tax to vote. Obviously, we do not have that today. You don't need money to vote, but this is what was passed at the time to try to keep Blacks from voting. It was the equivalent of several days' pay, which might not sound like a big deal, but remember, as mentioned in another video, Blacks, many of them are stuck in the South sharecropping, dependent upon whites, and are not able to economically break free. And so paying a poll tax was actually going to be a big burden. Eventually, this will get abolished with the passage of an amendment in the 1960s. Another thing, though, that was done was the literacy test. This is testing blacks' ability to technically read and write, but it was used in a manipulative way to try to keep blacks from voting. So they'd have to read a passage from the US Constitution and write it, and then answer a series of questions. And this was administered to whites too, but if it was administered to blacks, they were often given way harder questions with way harder parameters in order to pass it. So it was really, really difficult questions versus if you were a white person taking a literacy test, you might just have to get one question right and it'd be a lot easier question. So this was also used to keep blacks from politically having a say. There was something called the grandfather clause passed to try to help those poor whites that were maybe uneducated and could not pass the literacy test. This was grandfathering them in by basically saying, as long as your grandfather voted before 1867, then you could vote. And remember, blacks could not vote prior to that. So it was a way to kind of safeguard those whites that had been not able to vote because of the poll tax or literacy test. Remember, the literacy test is especially so hard for blacks, as we mentioned with the Jim Crow laws. They are in segregated and way, way, way worse off schools. So this was really, really hard. And this, unfortunately, is going to be successful at keeping many blacks from voting. On top of that, the Ku Klux Klan is formed after the Civil War. It is formed in Tennessee. A group of ex-Confederate soldiers are unhappy with the outcome of the Civil War, and they're going to be led by this guy up here, Nathan Bedford Forrest. He will be the Grand Wizard of the KKK, and it soon spreads to all of the other states. They include in their ranks mayors, sheriffs, all sorts of law enforcement officers. And you just never knew who was a member of the Klan or not. They wore these white robes and they hid their identity. So it was very intimidating because you didn't know who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. What they would do is their primary objective was to intimidate blacks from voting. So it might be burning their churches and schools, because those were places where blacks would try to be educated or at least organize themselves. They'd go after blacks by murdering them and lynching them, or whites too that were helping them. So carpetbaggers or scalawags, these white Republicans that were trying to help the blacks get the right to vote, they might meet this fate. And lynchings, like I mentioned, these were unjustified mob ruling, taking actions in their own hands and hanging people, not because they were found guilty of anything. This is going to dramatically increase, specifically trying to intimidate blacks. The KKK utilizes this technique to try to stop blacks from voting. And unfortunately, it is quite successful, understandably so. It would be incredibly intimidating to try to exercise that right to vote if you were black at this time. And as you can see, look at what ends up happening. In 1890, 55% of the Selma, Alabama residents were black, and only 1% of them were voters. Similar situation in Birmingham, Alabama. So unfortunately, as we mentioned, on paper, blacks' lives looked to be getting dramatically better after the Civil War, but thanks to Jim Crow laws, the rise of the KKK, and these other political tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests, it is going to be far from equal, to say the least. Thanks, guys.